Good to see you, everyone! My name is Robbie Howell, and today I'm going to be bringing you another of my world-famous Age of Empires 2 Theorycrafted builds. If you don't know me, I am a game designer focusing primarily on narrative tabletop storytelling games, but I have a lifelong love of Age of Empires 2, which inspired in me a lifelong love of history. And so here I am spending my free time making up civilizations in a game that I will never have any sort of developmental license to work on. But this is where life brings us sometimes. Today I'm going to be bringing you another lovely African civilization, courtesy of a good friend of mine down in the comments section, Mr. Leonardo Marquez. Yes, Leonardo, I haven't forgotten about your suggestion, and I am very happy to follow through with it. As such, today we will be looking at the Mossi, a cavalry civilization. Yes, that is pronounced Mossi rather than Mossi, at least based on the sources that I found. Without any further ado, let's move on, beginning with the history and background of the Mossi people before getting into a little bit more later on about how I translated that history into game mechanics. As always, if you are interested in the more in-depth gritty details of my build, I have a comprehensive civilization doc in the description, along with the sources that I primarily consulted in the generation of this particular build. Let's move on, shall we? But before we get in, a couple disclaimers as always. As per usual, I am not a historian, and there is a lot of bad history out there, especially where it comes to medieval Africa. There's not a lot of written records, and a lot of people just kind of make stuff up. And as such, I'll be doing my absolute best with what resources the internet has provided me. Additionally, of course, I can't test any of my designs, and also relevant, there's a lot of great designers out there on the internet who have created their own builds of the Mossi. I did not consult these builds in generating my own. Even my good friend Leonardo, who made the initial suggestion for this build, left his own design for the Mossi in his comment. It was great, I liked it a lot. I did not take direct inspiration from it when creating my own build here. Additionally, as a game designer, I tend to enjoy complexity and favor pushing the boundaries rather than sticking with the status quo, and I'm a big favor of increasing variety and options, as well as directly translating history mechanics as literally as possible. With all that crap out of the way, let's talk about the Mossi. So when we talk about the Mossi, we are generally referring to a group of federated kingdoms that existed across many contemporary national borders, including Burkina Faso, Ghana, Togo, Niger, maybe a couple others as well. However, before the Mossi kingdoms were founded and federated together, they were preceded by a Ghanaian kingdom known as Dagbon. Now, Dagbon was established sometime around the 1000s AD by horsemen coming out of the east. This idea of itinerant horsemen founders of nations is a recurring theme we will find later in other elements of Mossi tradition and history. And the reason that I consider Dagbon to be predecessors is because many elements of their culture, especially elements of horsemanship and nobility and religion, directly translated into what eventually became the Mossi, as well as the fact that the original Mossi city-states were founded by Dagbon nobles. The Dagbon were not alone in this part of Africa. They obviously had the Mandinka, who would later become the Mali Empire, to contend with to the north, who they both traded with and raided with and messed around with on and off. But eventually, in a story we will cover a little bit later, a handful of Dagbon nobles rode out to found their own nation. And this became the Mossi kingdoms. Now, the Mossi settled their first major city on the lands of an established tribe, another element that we will touch upon more later. And that city was named Wage Sabre Sobakumbem Tenga. Bit of a mouthful, but don't worry, they shortened it to something you may be familiar with. Now, these lands were not unoccupied. In fact, there were a great many local cultures who were already present in the areas that these Dagbon nobles rode into and settled. I have them represented here by all manner of current African nations. We have the Ethiopians, we have the Malians, and we have my civilization, the Ouagadugans, link up here to go watch that video, all could represent elements of the current local tribes, though I prefer ones that were slightly more accurate. They just don't exist yet in the game. And what the early Mossi did is they rode around and they consolidated power. They conquered tribes and they allowed them a strong amount of self-governance while also installing their own noble class among them. This allowed the Mossi to create a rather powerful collection of city-states who all generally worked together. Until, that is, they rebelled, as often happens in such arrangements. So the many city-states, especially the very powerful ones, split apart in rebellion, and only once they had been individually reconquered did the entire collection federate into a single unified entity that could finally be called the Mossi Kingdoms proper. I think there were 19 total city-states, but the important ones were Ouagadougou, Tenkodogo, Fadeungurma, Yatenga, and Busuma. These 5 city-states provided the bulk of the military support that was definitely needed in these days of tribal warfare, as well as having the largest economic hubs. I believe almost all of them were built along rivers. You may notice a familiar name in there, Ouagadougou. This was what they shortened that very long name of their original capital to. And as it happens, since many of the languages in this region are related, the name that they shortened it to, Ouagadougou, happened to have a lot of cognates in terms of its sounds and meaning to Ouagadou, one of the preceding major powers in West Africa, and a civilization that I have already made a build for. Again, go check it out. So anyways, at this point the Mossi have consolidated their power, they have a strong federation, and they're doing great. Even though the Mali are becoming powerful to their west, they hold out very effectively against Mali invasions while continuing to build power in their own home region. That is until a familiar opponent rose, familiar at least to the various African nations that you'll find in this time frame, that being Islam, specifically born by the Songhai. Now the Songhai were a sub-Saharan people. I have them represented here as Berbers, but they really weren't. They should be their own civilization, and I'll likely take a crack at making them in a future video. But either way, they were a very Islamic people, one of the first properly sub-Saharan African peoples to be converted in full to the religion of Islam, and they proceeded to launch a major war against the staunchly animist Mossi. Not only did they launch one war, they launched several, and they even declared an official crusade against the Mossi. There was very fierce fighting for almost a full century, and eventually the Mossi were defeated, and the Songhai invaders settled and set up shop in their lands. However, even with this massive Islamic presence, the Mossi remained animist, doing so in secret or adopting Islamic tenets at the face of it, but ignoring them for the most part once the local imams turned their backs. And likely partially because of this fierce cultural preservation, they managed to regain their independence towards the end of the AoE2 relevant time frame, actually kicking the Songhai out of their country and re-establishing themselves as an independent federation of animist states, though they did retain some amount of Islamic presence that they tolerated, at the very least. You may notice that on my timescale, I have the Mossi existing from 1000 to 1600 plus AD. That is because, unlike a great many of the other African nations that we see throughout the medieval period, the Mossi lasted well into the Industrial Age, even taking on a number of major colonial powers during the scramble for Africa. They held out against drastically more advanced militaries and were renowned for being such ferocious fighters that many colonial powers just left them alone and dealt with the surrounding lands. But anyways, that's beyond the AoE2 relevant time frame. Moving on to elements of their flavor, their architecture would obviously be African in nature, with unique skins for the castle, as that has become the status quo, and the stable, as horses are incredibly important to Mossi culture, as we'll get into a little bit more later. Their units would speak the Maore language, Jumbo, ladies and gentlemen, which, from what I could find, was the most prominent of the dozens of local tribal languages that were spoken within the Mossi kingdoms. Their wonder would be the Mogonaba Palace. This might be a little bit of an anachronistic choice, as this palace, as pictured in this photo, is of course from a much later date, but it is known that the Mogonaba, which I believe was specifically the name reserved for the king of Ouagadougou, did have a rather luxurious palace as far back as the nation's founding, and as such, I think a wonder that reflected and represented this contemporary version of the palace, while taking a couple of creative liberties as well, could make for a very engaging and interesting wonder design, especially because it's kind of the only contender. The Mossi weren't really known for their gigantic, elaborate buildings. Now, moving on to their campaigns. There are a number of very interesting characters to be found in Mossi history, but above and beyond all of the others stands the warrior princess Yenenga. Now, Yanenga was one of those Dagbon nobles I was talking about earlier who lived in northern Ghana. According to legend, she was by far and away the best fighter in her father's kingdom. A master horseman, a great javelineer. She was so valuable that she was given an entire regiment to command before she was even out of her teenage years, and it soon became the talk of the nation as to who she would marry. Yanenga's father, however, was loath to lose his best warrior, and so forbade her from marrying. To which she upped and left, taking a handful of loyalists out into the wild in a self-imposed exile. There she met a local hunter of a different tribe. They fell in love, had a couple of babies. She goes back to her father, who says, okay, I guess you did it anyways. You should probably go and found your own kingdom now. So she was the one who led the first group of Dagbon nobles out of Ghana to establish the Mossi kingdoms, with her son Uedraogo establishing the city of Ouagadougou, which stood as the capital of the Mossi kingdoms, as well as the capital of modern Burkina Faso. There's not much to say about why Yanenga would make a great campaign protagonist. She's a cool, badass warrior woman with a really interesting story who traveled a lot and met a lot of other engaging and fun characters. Lots of fighting to be had. She fought against the Malians, who apparently knew her by name and feared her so much that their cavalry would rout off the battlefield if they heard she was there. Just stupidly cool character who was directly responsible for the founding of the Mossi kingdoms. Now, Yanenga is kind of a tough act to follow. I was considering pitching her son Uedraogo as another campaign protagonist, but unfortunately, I could find diddly shit about him on the internet. I'm sure it exists, I just couldn't find it anywhere. Though, as an interesting point, his name, Uedraogo, is still a very popular surname in Burkina Faso, from what I could find. There is one other potential character, though, that I think could make for an interesting Mossi protagonist, that being Tohaji. Tohaji was the legendary founder of Dagbon. Again, not technically Mossi, but I would say that they are culturally, geographically, and societally similar enough that they could still be represented by the Mossi civilization. Tohaji was the leader of that group of horsemen that rode out of the east to found the kingdom of Dagbon. But he didn't just go straight from the east wherever he started down to Dagbon itself. Instead, he went straight into the heart of the great kingdom of Ouagadougou and offered his services of himself and his men as mercenaries. And so he was sent to fight all sorts of tribal battles around central western Africa for a number of years before being rewarded with passage down to what would become Dagbon. I'm pretty sure that he bagged a Malian princess on the way, remained on pretty good terms with his northern neighbors, but then his descendants started fighting with them. Either way, it seems like a very cool nomadic campaign protagonist. You could have a lot of fun cavalry raiding and not a ton of base building, though there would definitely be some of that as well, and it would deeply involve the Malian and Ouagadougan civilizations, probably fighting against Berbers and the as of yet unmade Songhai civilization. I don't think he's quite as cool as Yanenga, and he hits a lot of the same beats as being a legendary horseman with a nomadic lifestyle who would go on to found an empire, but it's good to have some variety in there, and he's definitely up there for one of the more interesting characters in Mossi and Dagbon history. Now, besides their own campaigns, I saw a couple of places that the Mossi could fit in. Obviously, in the Sunjata campaign, you can fill in a couple of the existing civilizations that they just cram Malians and Ethiopians into as being the Mossi instead. For example, in Sunjata 2, I believe there's a scenario that features Niger as an enemy faction. Those could totally be filled in by the Mossi, as the Mossi did control a good chunk of Niger during their existence. The Yodit scenarios also have a couple of minor factions that could totally be played by the Mossi. In particular, Yodit 1, I could see one of the enemy camps being played by the Mossi. Beyond that, they're kinda limited in their campaign featurings, but as mentioned in my build for the Ouagadougans, there are tons of potential West African civilizations that could be made, and I'm sure the Mossi would play a major part in any campaign to come out of those dominions. So what did I get out of my study of Mossi history? How did I bridge the gap from fact to game mechanics? Well, the first thing I noticed is the idea of federation. Of course, the Mossi themselves were a collection of kingdoms that worked together, but this theme of federation, I felt, went well beyond just the eventual convergence of the major city-states. Even when those early Dagbon nobles were first moving into the locations they would one day rule, they were not vicious with the locals. Instead, they sought to establish themselves as a warrior class to protect the locals, and gave the locals a lot of religious and cultural power in their stead. There's this incredible idea in Mossi society of the distinction between the Nakomse and the Tengabisi. The Nakomse were their word for the noble class, and I put quotation marks around this deliberately. These were warriors, politicians, men who made decisions based on cold logic and pragmatism. They were meant to be the bulwarks of the society. The Tengabisi were the farmers, the artisans, almost all of whom were descended from the local stock of the area. And these guys, in addition to having a lot of economic power, were given almost all of the religious authority in the realm. As such, the Nakomse's place was war and politics, but the Tengabisi's religious institutional power allowed them to override the Nakomse's decisions if they thought they would not sufficiently behoove the people. It was kind of one of the first examples I could find of checks and balances arising in a medieval African society. In fact, it might be the only example of that in a medieval African society. And it was just a rather remarkably nuanced and sophisticated way of going about governance, especially with all of the intertribal grudges and tensions that were present across all of Africa during this point in history. On top of this, the Mossi would not be the Mossi without their horses. Horsemanship was a massive part of their culture and society. Both times it was migratory bands of horse-riding nobles with great military ability. And this cultural identity permeated many parts of Mossi society. Oftentimes, wealth and status were proportional to how many horses you owned. A lot of surnames and titles and epithets had to do with your mastery over horses. If I haven't made it clear yet, this was a pretty big deal for them. And for good reason, too. Horses were a huge part of their economy. Even once they were settled in their kingdoms, the Mossi were primarily herdsmen economically, and they supplemented a lot of this by raiding the shit out of their neighbors and plundering everything that wasn't stapled down. This incredible mobility, thanks to a gigantic force of gifted horsemen, allowed them to pretty much take their pick of the vulnerable towns nearby and exact tributes from the ones that were smart enough to not put up a struggle. You don't often think about great horsemanship coming out of Africa, but the Mossi are a living, breathing embodiment of it, and it's something that is absolutely critical for any build of theirs to represent. On top of that, they are a very proud people, one who resisted invasion, conversion, and colonization for hundreds of years. It's kind of tough to represent a mechanic like this in a game like Age of Empires, but for what it's worth, their semi-autonomous form of rulership allowed them both a lot of flexibility in how their nation addressed incoming issues, and in many ways allowed it to be more flexible in the face of invasion, while also allowing its citizens a great many rights and privileges that wouldn't even be heard of in this part of the world for centuries to come. The most obvious example of this, of course, is the resistance versus the Songhai, but many other powers would test the Mossi even before the age of colonialism. The Songhai did the best against them, but it wasn't for lack of trying. The Malians did not like these guys whatsoever, especially once the Malian Empire was in full swing. And this brings us to the end of our history, culture, and flavor sections. If this is all that you've came for, thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to learn more history through the lens of Age of Empires. For all the rest of you, however, let's talk game mechanics, because there's a lot to work with when it comes to the Mossi. So to give a summary of the Mossi's bonuses, they are obviously a cavalry civilization. When they build their first stable, they get a free cow, and aging up gives them a free cow at every stable they have constructed. This is in reference, of course, to their major herding economy. Additionally, husbandry, the technology, gives twice as much speed as it normally does to other civilizations. The Mossi were amazing horsemen, and this bonus will allow their cavalry to zoom around the map at Cobra Car speed, outspeeding any other civilization currently in the game. Moreover, their javelin units, and they have 3 of them, have +1 attack and attack faster, giving them a huge edge in both feudal age warfare, late game trash wars, and even a little bit of raiding if you're willing to use javelins for such purposes. And lastly, whenever you kill an enemy villager with any Mossi soldier, the next villager you train costs 20% less and takes 20% less time to train. This bonus does stack. and it even stacks beyond 100%, meaning if you kill 6 villagers, the next one is free and trains instantly, and the one after that has 20% discount in both regards. Bopping down to the final line there, their team bonus is that the light cavalry line may be trained at theirs and all of their allies' town centers. Now, this uses each specific civilization's own upgrades and bonuses, and it does allow certain civilizations, like the Meso civilizations who can't normally get scouts, to actually build them. They'll be garbage, but you still can. Their unique unit, the Nakomse, is a hybrid melee and ranged cavalry. Yes, I did think of this idea well before the Dynasties of India expansion was leaked, and it works differently than the Ratha. Just you wait, I'll tell you a little bit about it in a second. Their unique technologies, however, take them in a completely different direction. The Tengabisi technology, researched in the Castle Age, allows villagers to collect relics and town centers to garrison one relic apiece. Doing so will make resources within that town center's line of sight last 33% longer, more than double the benefit of the Mayans bonus, and it applies to farms. Meanwhile, the Dimas tech, available in the Imperial Age, will make it such that your entire team, including you of course, can produce their unique units at a 20% discount. This is in relevance to the fact that each of the Mossi kingdoms had their own autonomous ruler, who was somewhat of a puppet, but at the same time was very much subject to both the will of his people and to the High King in Ouagadougou. As mentioned before, it's kind of hard to translate autonomous rulership to game mechanics, but I felt like this unique units cheaper team-wide was kind of a cool way of referencing that diversity in governance and leadership. The Mossi unique unit, the Nakomse, would cost a bit more gold than a light cavalry, but otherwise have very similar stats, with slightly lower pierce armor, but even with a bonus against monks and a resistance to conversion. However, whenever the Nakomse is at more than 2 range from a target, it will throw a javelin rather than rushing in to fight at melee. This javelin is vaguely comparable to that of a Genitor, but it doesn't have bonus against archers, and it does a good deal more damage. Whenever an enemy closes past that 2 range marker, however, the Nakomse would abandon their javelins and charge into melee combat. Though they don't have any explicit bonuses against archers, they are, as mentioned, a very strong anti-monk unit. And with this versatility between melee and ranged attacks, they should be very good both at raiding and in pitched battles when you need them to be. If you'd like more details on the Nakomse and more specifics about all of the civilization's bonuses, please check out my Civ doc down in the description. With all that summarized, let's talk about the Mossi's strengths. Cavalry, cavalry, cavalry. Of course. Where would we go without cavalry? They have a complete tech tree. Everything is available to them besides the weird regional specific units and the final armor tech. They do, of course, have that massive husbandry bonus, letting them zoom around at top speed. Their cavalry are good at every single stage of the game. Their scout rush is amazing, their mid-game is amazing when husbandry kicks in, and their late game, though they aren't quite as beefy as some other civilizations, will see them dominating map control and winning a lot of the fights that they put their forces towards. That funky scouts built at the town center bonus can also allow for a pretty interesting all-in, as well as making it so that at the end of the game, when you already have your villagers maxed out, you can turn your town centers into functional stables to assist in production. All that cavalry is going to be very susceptible to enemy helps, which is where your skirmishers and genitors come in. Yes, the Mossi have the mighty Genitor available to them, though unlike the Berbers, they do not make it available for all of their allies. That javelin bonus of theirs hits 3 units, namely the skirmisher, the Genitor, and their unique Nakomse unit when it's throwing at a range. This means that their javelins are a lot more viable for things besides just archer battles. You can consider even raiding with their skirmishers if you don't want to commit the gold to a proper archer rush in Feudal Age. Their Genitors late game are also very good for harassing enemy villagers, not to mention backing up your cavalry as they're zooming around, as the Genitors do of course gain the benefits from that husbandry bonus. Their archers do of course miss out on the final armor upgrade again, but even with that they should be a pretty strong backbone to your army and a great supplement to your powerful cavalry frontline. Lastly, the Mossi should have a very consistent economy, with bonuses kicking in at every stage of the game. The bonuses that you get from killing enemy villagers should help you a little bit here and there early on, with those cows coming in feudal and castle to really give you a big injection of food right as you should be needing it. And once you hit Imperial Age, researching Tengabisi will allow your farms to be maximally efficient and your wood lines to last a little bit longer even when your enemy is starting to dry up on total resources. You could even sneak a Tengabisi relic into a town center by an invaluable mine to ensure that you get 33% more gold or stone out of that mine than your enemy would, which can really make or break the game when you get into post-Imperial. Besides those major strengths, they have very good cavalry archers. Besides having an almost complete archer tech tree, they have both thumb ring and Parthian tactics very critically, allowing their cavalry archers to go toe-to-toe with some of the best ones in the game, especially when you factor in that all-important husbandry bonus, making them by far and away the fastest that you'll see of any civilization. The Mossi are also quite interesting when you consider them in the context of team games, like a 4v4. That Dimas unique technology can make previously bad unique units look a whole lot more viable with a 20% reduced price tag. The prospect of a 4-person TC included scout rush also sounds like an interesting enough option that I think it will be tried out at least a couple of times. I'm not saying it's good, I'm saying it's interesting, and it might work once in a blue moon, you never know. As you might expect, however, the Mossi are not good at everything. In fact, one could even argue they're very bad at a great many things besides the things that they are good or competent at. For one, their defenses are the big poo. They miss out on tons of essential university technologies, including fortified wall, keep, architecture, hoardings at the castle, treadmill crane. There's a whole bunch more, but I only had so much space on this particular slide. On top of all that, they have a really painful miss at their siege workshop. They cannot build mangonels, even the first upgrade, and they don't have siege engineers once you hit Imperial Age. This means that their siege is going to be not good at best, and without mangonels, fending off Castle Age aggression is going to be quite difficult. The mangonel is such a critical tool for staving off early pressure against your palisade walls and houses. It'll be really crippling to not have access to it, and just forces the Mossi to take map control as often as they can. Unsurprisingly, the Mossi's infantry also suck. They don't even get chainmail armor, and though you do get halberdier, yay, you can't get two-handed swordsmen or supplies. So you're stuck with some very stinky infantry. I think a little bit worse than even the Tatars, which is saying something. To cap it all off, their navy is among the very worst in the game. It's even worse than the Aztecs, without access to galleon, fast fire ship, cannon galleon, and some essential technologies like careening and shipwright. I'll admit right now, I might have been a little too cruel with this navy. It is so bad as to be almost debilitating on even hybrid maps, but it is accurate to history, and if you wanted to be nice, you could maybe throw galleon back in there for them. Lacking careening already means they're going to lose pretty much every water fight they go up against, but that's not supposed to be their strength. They're supposed to be on land with their horses. So how do I think the Mossi would play? Well, I'm sure you're starting to get an idea as well just from looking through their strengths and weaknesses. Early game, it's all going to be about your scout rush. You're trying to get in there, get some villager kills, get a couple of free cows off your stables, and make as many stables as you can to benefit from that age-up cow dump. And with more cows, you can make more scouts, and the cycle begins anew. With all of these amazing bonuses, your opponent would be a fool to not prepare for early game scout aggression, and this is where you can surprise them with a different rush. Even though the Mossi have a poor archer line and obviously dreadful infantry, you can still do plenty with them in Feudal Age. Some archers, men-at-arms, those are both things you can totally do, not to mention the possibility of a skirm rush. That javelin unit bonus could make skirms a whole lot more viable early game, not to mention they're great for countering the spearmen the opponent likely made to deal with your scouts. So early game, you have tons of options, and getting a strong foothold early game will catapult you into a commanding position in the mid game. Your goal at this point is to take and hold map control. You want to use your fast units to zoom all over the place and ensure that your opponent doesn't have a chance to push against your crappy defenses. To this end, the Mossi aren't very good at slow pushing themselves. Their units aren't necessarily powerhouses, and without great defenses or access to mangonels, it gets a lot dicier when you start getting into castle fights and things of that nature. But with access to all these fast powerhouse units like your knights, your Nakomse, your genitors, you don't even have to worry about defenses as you pick your opponent apart from multiple sides, tap dancing and running circles all around them. The map is your oyster and your cavalry are your pearl. Once you hit the late game, however, you have to start thinking about closing it out before your opponent can regain their footing. You do have some really strong cavalry. Their paladins are almost fully upgraded and can make for a reliably overwhelming finishing blow once you've massed up a number of them. Besides that, however, you're going to have to rely on your eco. Your Tengabisi technology should allow you to have a great resource advantage over your opponent. You just have to make sure that your Castle Age map control allowed you to get as many relics as possible to enable the technology. technology. Once your gold starts to run low, however, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble. You have your scout cavalry line, and that can do some work for you. You have your javelin units, those are pretty good, but you're going to have trouble in late game trash wars because of your lack of mangonels. Those can really do a lot of work in late game trash wars, and lacking them will make it so that your opponents will likely be able to sweep your units aside in a pitched battle and reach your paper-thin defenses. So that's a rough summary of how I think the Mossi are going to play, but before we wrap up, I want to share with you a couple of lingering questions and some cool ideas that didn't quite make my build. To start off with, I'm really not sure about their tech tree. I left a lot of major holes that you're going to have to dance around when you're playing the Mossi. They have crappy navy, they don't have their infantry, they lack crossbow and mangonel. That's a lot of huge gaps that other civilizations don't normally need to deal with. Additionally, the fact that they incentivize early game raiding so much might make it such that their games end too early. Even for a generic civilization, early raiding can make or break a game. And so adding even more swing factor on top of that raiding potential might make games a little too one-sided to be satisfying. Along those lines, they're just overall a bit of a predictable civilization, and I feel like once someone is adjusted to how the Mossi play, they'll be pretty good at thwarting them at every turn. The Mossi have a lot of trouble if an enemy can get up their walls in feudal age before their scouts come in, and I'd be interested to see whether canny players can overcome this disadvantage via map control, relic collection, and similar, or whether it's just too much of a problem for the civilization and needs to be addressed in some balancing. But enough of all that gloom and doom, let's get to the fun stuff, some tabled ideas that didn't quite make my build. The stable I knew from the start would play a major role in the Mossi civilization, and one of my early ideas is that it would act as a food drop point and would give you something like maybe a 10% increased food bonus when you dropped at it. Just a fun and unique little nod to their herding economy. Additionally, I had another idea where cavalry could spawn for free at stables when you age up, but that to me felt really swingy. I know a lot of people really hate bonuses like the Sicilians' First Crusade technology that gives you a bunch of free units at once. It's really swingy, it's hard to deal with, it makes the game very tempo-based, and it's just overall not very satisfying, so I decided to ignore that. Another herding reference I had was that your herdables could last longer and decay slower, allowing you to get more bang for your buck with them when harvesting early game. I also briefly considered having the Tengabisi make an appearance as a unique unit, maybe a type of villager that could gather more efficiently but couldn't build? It definitely needed some religious connotations, so grabbing relics was on the table as well, but eventually I decided this would all just be more elegant to consolidate into a unique technology. Speaking of unique technology, war drums were a fairly iconic part of Mossi raids that I thought of referencing. My idea here is when you first created a unit, it would have an attack and speed boost that would fade over time. Cool idea, but I just thought it was a little bit generic, and I wasn't quite sure how it fit in with the remainder of the civilization's playstyle. Plus, it just feels a little bit generic. A lot of civilizations had war drums, so giving it just to the Mossi felt a little bit arbitrary. Also, in reference to the Dimas unique technology, that idea of autonomous government and a bunch of divided city-states all working together, I had this idea that if you built castles really far apart from each other, they would get cheaper, kind of to represent like going out and founding a new kingdom that could collaborate with you. I don't know, it was a fun idea. I think it could really work well for some civilization. I just didn't want the Mossi to have a defensive focus, and so I decided to stay away from anything that impacted the castle like that. And lastly, an idea I loved, but just was too janky to work, is that villagers resist conversion. I even had this idea that they could be immune to conversion, but how often do you convert enemy villagers? It like never comes up. And the selling point on top of that was that your villagers would have this massive plus 12 attack versus enemy monks. Like, you know, get those Songhai out of here, we're animist people. It's such a fun, flavorful idea, but unfortunately, it's trash. Like, villager versus monk never happens. I didn't want to give them a throwaway but cool bonus when I had so many other interesting ideas lined up, but I had to mention it. It was such a fun idea, and I wish it worked. But I'm afraid, my friends, we are out of time for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about the Mossi kingdoms with me and see how I translated them to an Age of Empires 2 civilization. Before we sign off, we'll take a quick gander at the old likely-ometer. How likely do I think it is that a civilization called the Mossi could make it into Age of Empires 2, whether it looked like my build or not? And for the Mossi, on the likely-ometer, we have An 8 out of 10, about the same score I gave the Ouagadugans. I think the Mossi are one of the top contenders for a new African civilization to be added to the game. They're flavorful, they're engaging, they're really different from a lot of the African civilizations currently there, and with their massive cavalry focus, it could make for a really fun, fast playstyle. But that is all that I have for you for today. Tell me, friends, what did you think of my build? How did you like it? What would you have done differently? Do you see any gaping flaws or any strokes of genius that you might never have thought of yourself? And on top of all that, what civilization would you like to see me tackle next? Please leave a comment down below. I love reading them. I love seeing your civilization ideas. And until we meet again, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now. Fuck. There we go. Age of baby.